Know Thyself is dedicated to the exploration of the most rewarding task an individual can ever embark on, the journey to find oneself. Our intention is to investigate the universal principles that have equipped our species to seek the treasure of all treasures, self-knowledge. With your host, Daniel Pawinski and Eduardo Manteca, this is the Know Thyself podcast. Cool. Awesome. Welcome to the Know Thyself podcast. I'm here with Daniel Pawinski.
Hello.
I'm Eduardo. And yeah, as we always do, having conversations before we go on to recording and sort of structuring our, or just formatting what we're going to be able to discuss today and how it relates to last week's episode and how it's going to relate to the episodes that are coming in the future. And so in this case, we're going to divide up the 7 stages of alchemy. So we said we'd be doing all the 7 stages. Last week we started with the first, which is calcination. And Daniel thought it'd be appropriate that in that time that you're going through your calcination period, if you are, what better to, aid you in sort of understanding some of the definitions that we had for calcination and kind of seeing the perspective from the East and the West. You were just telling me before the podcast on like the same word may not mean the same thing, but we all do have an understanding of the same thing. So let's sort of do a good job at like laying it out so that way people can see it and understand what this word or this definition actually means and where it's coming from. So more specifically, what we did is after we did the episode on calcination, Daniel and I discussed, maybe we should take a deeper dive as we always do, but in this case with the ego and what the ego really means and the ego that we're actually talking about, maybe one that you think you're familiar with, or maybe you are already familiar with, and what really it entails on its role with the soul, or what the ego has to do with the soul. So it's the duality between its relationship to the soul. That's what I should say. And so one of the things that we decided on is to take a lecture from the Brotherhood of Light. Now, Daniel's talked about the Brotherhood of Light before. In previous podcasts, we mentioned that, it's a source for that scientific approach of understanding the soul, but it correlates with all the things that we've already been talking about throughout the entire podcast with Hermeticism and, other Egyptian sciences. So this lecture, which is again from the Brotherhood of Light, it's phenomenal. It's a lot to digest, but there's a lot of great, there's a lot of more specific explanations that we should probably cover before we sort of use the word ego and what the journey of the alchemist is, by sort of bringing up these lectures and breaking them down a little more specifically in between the 7 stages of alchemy. So, like I said, Daniel's mentioned about the Brotherhood of Light, but can you guys give us a little more on the history of it? I know that you were mentioning to me that their origins, I know they go back a long time. I mean, at least 100 years now, right?
Yeah, so the organization has been around for a really long time, and it's called the Brotherhood of Light. You can also, I think they go by the Church of Light as well, and you can find them online. It's just light.org, and it's a really fantastic organization because they have all their lessons online, but they also have like a whole path that you can actually do learning from, and you can actually take quizzes on some of these books, and they'll actually send you more in-depth knowledge, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So if you become a member and you finish the first book, you can actually take a test on that book, and they'll actually send you kind of the esoteric information, which is crazy because when you're reading these lessons, you're like, this is the most esoteric stuff I've ever read, right? It's really, really dense. And
it is very dense.
The writer, C.C. Zane, who's Albert Benjamin, his pen name for this organization was C.C. Zane. He was a naturalist. So he was an individual that understood the natural outside. So he really kind of has a scientific approach to esoteric and occult studies. And this was a really, really prominent organization. They were right in Los Angeles, so they were really close to, I know we have a lot of listeners who are very fond of the Philosophical Research Society, which was created by Manly P. Hall, but they were in the same neighborhood. They worked together. C.C. Zane was a little bit older than Manly P. Hall, so I believe he passed away in the the mid 50s, early 60s, where Manly P. Hall survived all the way up into the 1990s, but was really kind of like I don't want to say a precursor, but was just part of this esoteric occult community, right? This idea of blending science and spirituality together, and the marriage between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, and not only having this holistic spiritual approach to the universe and what we consider God, but also this analytical idea, and the idea that you can actually, just like you can test a physical science in a laboratory, you can also test a spiritual science. And that's a really important aspect. And that's something that not all of the New Age has missed out on, but I think the New Age has kind of moved away from. And that's something you really want to be able to validate. All this stuff, all this spiritual information should be able to be validated in the experiment of life.
Absolutely.
And that's really kind of where we want to kind of take it. And that's, again, why the study of alchemy is such a fascinating endeavor to take on, because you start seeing it is like making your life an experiment. It is putting your life through this transformation, and you see the results of it. So you can actually, quantify the experience that you're having and kind of incorporate it with the science.
Absolutely.
Right? It's the science of life. So yeah, the Brotherhood of Light is a great organization. Definitely check them out. And they have services as well that you can watch on Zoom. They're now located in New Mexico, but I actually went to a conference of them a couple of years ago. They have biannual conferences in New Mexico, and it's just like the coolest people in the world. Like, they're all older astrologers now. There's not a lot of young blood in that organization, so all of us youngins should kind of go in there and kind of give it support, but they're just the most amazing people, and they're just a master astrologers.
I know. I remember you came back, you were just like,
it blew me away.
We're just scratching the surface.
Yeah. It was so crazy. And it was so funny. I remember too, I was like sitting in, they're really big on, they're such a scientific organization. So this one was all based on astrology. Every conference is kind of focused on something different. But I had my birth chart out on a table because we were all reviewing our birth charts, and one of the astrologers walked by, and he was like walking by, kind of speed walking, going to talk to somebody else. And he just like glanced at my chart, and he just stopped. And he goes, "Oh my gosh, you've had a lot of jobs in your life." And like, if you know me, I've had a lot of jobs. Like, I'm just a gypsy when it comes to work, Like, I don't really get fired, but I just have had I wear a lot of different hats.
My first job was because of Danielle. I was 15
that's so
years
funny.
old, and my father told me, this is a true story. He said, if you want to buy CDs, there's no excuse for you not to pay for them yourself. Doesn't your friend Daniel have a job on the weekends? And I was like, oh man, here we go.
Right.
And that was it. And there's a few other jobs that I've worked at in my life because of you. You're like, hey man, you want to come work at this one store? I'm like, all right, let's do it.
It's always a variety. But yeah, it was just kind of a really cool experience. So definitely check out that organization. But what we're really going to be looking at today is, really just kind of breaking up a section of this entire chapter. We're going to, over the next couple weeks in between the podcast on alchemy, we're really going to kind of be breaking up this chapter, that just to kind of give a precursor, what we're going to kind of look at is, like Eddie spoke about, we're going to kind of go a little bit further with the discussion of the ego, how it correlates with the soul. And then one of the things that we're really going to work into is the cycle of necessity. And that's really the evolution of your soul from like the angelic realm. And we're going to kind of talk about that fall of man, which is in the Hermetic tradition of how we fall down the ladder and then we climb Jacob's ladder back up to heaven. Right. And that's kind of the experience we find ourselves in the middle right now. So we're going to kind of get a precursor of the soul prior to self-consciousness, right? Which is when you're human, you become self-conscious of the soul. So we're going to kind of talk about, what the Egyptians and what the kind of Western mystics really kind of thought of the evolution of the soul. And actually in this aspect, there's actually a lot of agreeance with the East as well, right? So of how the soul kind of almost has its like angelic birth from its angelic parents, and how it kind of goes down the ladder from the angelic, the celestial, to the spiritual, to the astral, then to the physical, and then the aspect of climbing that ladder back up. There's a lot of like unified thought on that, and then the aspect of where it kind of there's not so much like an argument, but just different perspectives. Some schools of thought think you have multiple human lives, and some schools of thought think you just have one human life. Mm-hmm. And again, we're going to get into that. We're going to discuss both sides. We're really going to look at, it really doesn't matter too much. You really just want to develop your character, whether you have multiple lives or not. We just want to become the best, most holy people we possibly can, right? But we'll go into that. We're going to go into the cycle to necessity. We're going to go into the two components that make up the soul. And I'm really kind of just throwing this out there just so we have a game plan of what these lessons that are going to be in between the steps of alchemy are going to be alluding to, because there's so much dense information in this chapter, and you'll see that through the Brother of Light. It's very heavy scientific stuff, and we're just going to really kind of try to distill it down and try to kind of take it piece by piece.
No, I love it. I mean, again, we sit here and we talk, before each podcast, and then the week before we sit down to come up with our plan for what we're going to sort of unravel. And so when you and I just talk away from the mics, I do have a million questions that I'm wondering, well, are others still wanting to have a definition to this, or are they catching up? I don't know. And I can't assume, or I shouldn't at least assume. So I'm really excited because we did, like I said, last week, bring up the ego.
Yeah.
And so now having the time to talk about that definition of the ego, the lower ego, as you were talking about, and then its role with the soul. So let's get into it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? One of the things too that we were chatting off microphone, and I kind of want to address is what we're talking about principles here. So if there's a term that we use and you're like, that's not the term I've heard about, right? So like how we're using the word ego, especially the higher ego, you might have learned this from your occult schools or your spiritual studies. It might have been spoken as spirit or something like that, right? So what you really need to do is, what we're doing is we're just kind of creating a common language. Mm-hmm. So as we move forward, when we say the true ego, you know what we're talking about. But these are spiritual principles. So as long as you know the principles, whatever word kind of gets used and gets interchanged, it's okay, just as long as you know what principle we're talking about. So when we talk about the true ego, we're talking about, the life force of all consciousness, the energy that is behind all consciousness, right? And the energy that's behind the universe. And some spiritual schools are going to call that spirit, and that's totally fine. So, but we just want you to know when we say true ego, you could be like, oh, I've learned this as spirit, and you can kind of put those together, right? And we're going to kind of see that through the schools. Like the principles are going to be the same from the east to the west, just sometimes we have different words to describe them, right? Because words are kind of transient, and think about how the amount of travel and the evolution of words and the evolution of language. So I really, how we kind of utilize that, just kind of be on the lookout. If we're using a term that's unfamiliar, we always define it. And then through your own spiritual study and your spiritual background, you could be like, oh, I know what they're talking about here. And neither one's right or wrong. We just need to know the principle. And that's really what the truth is. Like we need to just kind of figure out the principle. So if you want to use true self, if you want to use spirit, it's completely up to you when you're explaining this or you're talking about this or you're meditating on these ideas. Because the word isn't really what we're focused on. We're really just focused on, again, the principle.
Yeah, the signs and the symbols are different, but the path that leads to greatness, back to the aggregate, back to the top, is the same path.
It's the same path.
So
yeah, and that's what's so beautiful about that, and that's what validates all spiritual studies,
right?
And that's what validates all mystic studies. That's what validates every esoteric religion, whether it's esoteric Hinduism, whether it's esoteric Buddhism, whether it's esoteric Christianity. They're all pointing to the same direction, right? We're climbing that ladder back up to that oneness that at one point, which we're going to kind of talk about with the soul and the evolution of the soul, we were a part of, but we were just potential. So the goal is, after we kind of get differentiated and we kind of have this experience of falling into matter and climbing our way back up, not only are we making our way up to that oneness, but we're making that way back up as our character, as the soul that you're in right now.
Correct.
And that's kind of what the whole goal is.
And you can't go through those experiences of the soul to get there without the potentiality of the ego. Right?
Exactly.
And that's why they're working hand in hand, right? So they're dancing together.
They're dancing together. And the ego is that potentiality. It's the potentiality of all energy. Right. So we were kind of talking about this, and this is kind of like, again, you got to kind of turn on that third eye and really kind of see through your third eye. But when we think about the I, right? I think, therefore I am. And what that phrase does is, because it's a really powerful phrase, is the thought is going to have us imply that there's a thinker. So what that does is when we know that if anything is to be known, there must be a knower. So thoughts and feelings kind of validate our existence. So I think, therefore I am, what that entails is for us to be able to make that statement entails that there's a thinker. And that what that does is it validates our experience. It validates the idea that we are actually going through this conscious evolution, right? And it's a really, really powerful word, because if you actually break that down, either I think, therefore I am, or I am, therefore I think, it depends on, like the magic community really prefers the latter in that aspect. You kind of get down to the phrase of I am, which is the most powerful words you can possibly say in creation. I am, period. And it's the aspect that makes us a creator, and it makes us it partakes us in the aspect of creation, and we start to mirror the creator aspects that we are. So if we break that down even further, we get to the I, and that I it's that energy. It's that voice inside our head. It's that energy that's kind of powering us from. So what we're going to be looking at today is the ego and the soul, and how they both make up the I, but they almost make up different aspects of the I, if that makes sense. So
that's great. Yeah.
So like we can think about, like, we can all kind of connect to that I in our mind right now, the I of the moment, the I of the now, right? It's the present moment, and you can connect to your consciousness, right? So there's something very interesting about that, about consciousness, because that I, there's something that is similar to the I of yesterday, and there's something that's different from the I of yesterday. Okay. And so let's start with what is similar. Okay. So there's an aspect of that I that's similar to the I of yesterday. And what that is that's the ego. That's the energy that pushes life through. Right. Okay. And when we really kind of start thinking about the ego, this life force that is pushing life, that's pumping my heart, that's pumping your heart, we really can't come up with a beginning of that life energy. Right. And when we really kind of start breaking down the science of occultism, there is no beginning, because it's always been potential energy. Right. And what it's happening now is it's actually manifesting within us. So we're actually feeling that energy. But the I of today and the I of yesterday that is the same is that ego energy. And that's that life force energy. And we can't really think of existence without that I, whether before the beginning or the ending of it. Right? Because it's this universal life force. It's the energy that expresses all consciousness through. Okay. So we really can't, even in our minds, imagine a place that has no energy and no consciousness expression. Right. It's like almost impossible for us. Right. So that's the ego. So that makes up half of our consciousness. And that's that locomotive power force of our consciousness. So now the I from today that is different from the I of yesterday, that's the I of the soul. And what the soul's going to make up is it's going to kind of have a two-part process for what it adds to consciousness. So the soul is going to be the totality of all experiences, right, and also its ability to attract not only life forms to incarnate from, but also to attract the experiences in our life. Right. Right. So when we talk about the totality of all consciousness and all experiences, that's exactly what the soul is. The soul is very much the recorder of everything. So we think of it in our self-conscious life. You're always a little bit different than you were even when you started this podcast. You're going through this experience and you've heard my voice and you've gone through the experience of hearing these words. You're different from the beginning of this podcast, but there's still a part of you that's the same, and that's that life force that's behind you. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So, in regards to that famous quote, right? There's this famous quote that no man or woman steps into the river, the same spot of the river twice, because not only is it the same river, right, it's not the same person. Yeah. Because not only is the water moving and it's different water molecules and it's a whole different expression there, the individual has changed since the last time they stepped into that river, right? And we're always in this state of flux, this state of transition, and we're always adding a more complex design of what consciousness is. And through every experience, we kind of get a more complete picture of consciousness.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. Well, the the different states of consciousness, as stated in the lecture, the different stages of consciousness are a result from the activities that the soul has like partaked in or the experiences that it's had.
Right. Right. And the wider the range of experiences, the wider range of the experience, the expansion of the consciousness.
Exactly.
Okay. And this is why it's so important to go through this physical experience, because this physical experience, why we deal with duality in this realm is because we need to deal with duality, right? We need to know hot from cold.
Right.
We need to have that variety of experiences. We need to know, dryness from moisture. Again, the wider the experience, the wider the expansion of consciousness, and the faster you evolve consciousness. Okay. Even the aspect of love and fear, right? We need to go through that. And that's why the physical realm is so coarse, because it's just like a crash course in consciousness evolution.
Yeah.
Right. And it is, it's a hard experience to go through. We do a good job, I think, in this community and all the individuals that I speak to of, finding the beauty and in that hide and seek, finding God in everything. But it's a challenge. Absolutely. You know what I mean? Because it's a hard realm. There's one ring that rules this, and that's Saturn's ring, and he's a heavy, dense father, right? So we go through these experiences, and we go through this aspect of variety of experiences to kind of evolve the consciousness, to put a finer, complex structure of the soul, and every experience kind of builds on the next.
I like that you say finer, because with the comparison of you saying that in this experience that we live in, this realm we live on being so coarse is the same as to say what water must go through to filter itself out the other side. And that's just the same thing with the soul. For it to cleanse itself or to evolve or to be more pure, it has to go through such a coarse experience or set of experiences in order to come out fine on the other side. And people use all kinds of analogies, and there's all kinds of axioms and quotes about that kind of stuff. I'm like, how to fine tune yourself or sharpen your weapon, if you will. So yeah, I think it's awesome that you related to it being so coarse, because you're absolutely right. It has to be.
Right. It has to be coarse. And again, like that, the fortune cookie, the greatest fortune cookie is just like a great sailor's never made on calm seas.
Right.
And that's so true. And that's what they're talking about. They're talking about what the soul needs to kind of go through. Remember, this is a construct for experience. And that's why we got incarnated. And that's why you went from this journey. That's why you had the fall. This is the same thing as the fall from Eden. This is getting locked out of Eden. You were partaking in the Garden of Eden, but you took the bite of knowledge. You wanted to know what it was like to be a god. Mm-hmm. And so you go through this experience. And that's what the fall of Eden's all about. It's not about a girl eating an apple. It's about your subconscious actually going through that experience of like, no, I want to know. I want to accumulate love. And I want to accumulate wisdom. And again, you get banished from heaven because the only way you're going to get back up there is if you climb what we call Jacob's ladder to go back up. Right. But you incarnated. Like, there's a beautiful hermetic story of you're up in this cosmic realm and you're oneness, but you're just potential. And there's just this yearning for experience, for individualization. And there's just a part of you that just wants to look down into the abyss. And this is kind of how your conscious evolution happens. And what happens is you look into the abyss. And as you do that, as you actually put your head down and you actually look into the cold reality of materialism, gravitation starts pulling you down. Right. And then you start going through the spheres, and you're collecting experiences, and your soul's kind of starting to form as you go through these spheres. So you go from like what they call the celestial to the spiritual to the astral to the physical, right? And you kind of make your way down, and through that you're kind of getting the organization of what your soul is, but then you come back down to earth and you start the whole process. Right. You start as a single-celled organism and you make your way back up. And this is reflected in not only Egyptian mythology, this is the Druids believe this as well. Ancient Hinduism believe this as well. All the religions kind of believe that you almost start as a single-celled organism and you make your way up. And that's also one of the aspects. And we're going to get really in-depth into the cycle of necessity, but that's the other aspect of the soul. So as you go through evolution of consciousness and as you make more complex organization within your soul then has the ability to attract more complex forms of life. So when you start off simple, you have simple forms of life, and then you go through that experience as a mineral, right? And you go through that experience, and then what happens is at one point when you've kind of gone through all your experiences, your soul starts to push away from that mineral, and that's when you have death.
Right.
And you die from that mineral dies. And then you have this like phase where you go back into the astral realm. You kind of take the accumulation of all the experiences that your soul has collected, and then your soul attracts a more complex form. Now you don't just jump up to something insane. It's like you go from a single-celled organism to maybe a multi-celled organism. You go from like a mineral to a crystal, right? You keep slowly making that process, but you go from there. And then what happens is you have these lives and these lives and these deaths, and then you make your way up into like a blade of grass, right? Which is a very short lifespan. Right. And then you collect that consciousness and you keep going, then you die there and you go to the astral realm, you kind of recharge, and then you're always in the aspect of attracting a more perfect form of life, a more complex form, not more perfect, I should say, a more complex form of life to evolve your consciousness, because that's why you made the fall. Like you bit the apple. Right. Right. And you looked into the abyss. Yeah. Like your soul did this and you went through, but you had to. You could not you couldn't just stay in potential. You had to formulate yourself. It almost kind of comes back down to when we think of the paths that we go through, this is like the same kind of path as your Saturn returns. When we talked about you have to establish yourself, you have to actually, as a child, you're just pure potential, but then you have to constrict yourself and actually learn something and confine yourself to actually become something. Well, it's the same thing as mirrored in the cosmic realm. Right. You can stay in the oneness, but you're nothing. You're just part of that oneness. You're just potential. You can be anything, but you're not anything. Right. So that's why you have the fall into matter, and that's why we have the fall of man. And it's not seen as a bad thing. We weren't kicked out of heaven. Right. God just wanted us to experience it because God is experiencing through us. So for him to evolve, for consciousness to evolve, he needs us to fall. Exactly. And then to make our way back up. Well said. And that's the story that the soul has. And the soul story is your story since you've had your first incarnation, and you're not aware of those experiences, right? You're not aware of being a single-celled organism. You're not aware of being a blade of grass. You're not aware of being an animal, but you are. You have instincts. You digest your food without thinking it. You pump your blood without thinking it. Think about all the automations we have as humans that your body just automatically does, that your subconscious mind does. Well, that's because your soul at one point, that was its focus. And that's why it's able to do those things.
No, it's absolutely right, man. I know that I've said this before to myself, but to not like go too deep, but where it ends is where it begins. And until it's time to just be part of the oneness that we come from. And it just keeps going that way. And that oneness that I'm talking about is what people have given the name to home. I think it's very interesting that we've all agreed upon that term being that if we're returning home, home should be probably the sea of consciousness that we've talked about. And it's our job through different forms of embodiment of what the soul has to go through on this realm to just go back to that sea of consciousness and make its way back, like as you're saying, back up to that ladder, back to where we came from. And so I like that you're expressing more or less that we're not kicked out of heaven. It's just the process of understanding the relationship to the deity that we all like want to get to know, to really understanding that connection from where we're from. And that's what it is, but we're individualized to go through that path on our own to then finally find out that it's all the same. We're all one, Right. But you need to have these course experiences, as you were just saying prior to this, in order to differentiate that oneness, because you're right. When you're a child, or when you first arrive here, you are just all this potential, and it needs to be narrowed down more specifically in order to then amplify itself back up and lift the rest of them around, lift the rest around you to also see that plane of where you are right now, in order for all of us to ascend. So I think that's, I don't know. I just always like that as like the purpose of the soul.
Yeah. And you know what? You brought up a great point just about, we're just trying to make it home. And we've spoken about what's so beautiful about being in a community all together is we are just walking each other home. Right. And then you think about the hero's journey. What is the step of the hero's journey for the soul? It always has to return home. Right. That's what this whole process is. We think about Dorothy. We think about everything. All these characters always have to return back home. And now it's the physical representation usually of their home, but that's what the allegory is about.
Right.
Making it back home, climbing that ladder. And it's called Jacob's Ladder, and we climb it back up. And that's what music shows us. That's the 7 musical notes, and then the 8th note is the next octave. And you're always getting to a different level. And the aspect that you have to make your way back up to the Eden because you had the fall. Mm-hmm. So inside you, inside your soul, inside your consciousness, you know better than to be stuck in the mud and to be stuck in the material realm. That's why the phrase that, God's never going to pick you out of the mud. And the idea being because the universal energy is this like, better than this.
Right.
Like, why I'm not going to come down there. You come up to me. Like you left. You're the one that differentiated yourself. You wanted to do this, which it needed you to do and it wanted you to do. And it really kind of universe made us do it. But it's just like, no, like keep coming. You have to come up to me. Right. You have to feel that these finer substances. And there's that free will courage that has to come through because it can't just pick you up because then it doesn't evolve. It needs to go through these struggles. It needs to go through these trials and tribulations to keep the evolution of consciousness happening.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of what we're experiencing when we're dealing with that. And just, we can kind of just feel again, and this is why, finer substances are those spiritual substances that we have to make our way up to. And it's just really important that we kind of go on that journey and make sure that happens.
Absolutely, man.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I know we talked a little bit about self-conscious as an immortality. So I think that kind of alludes to that. What we're talking about is understanding what that really means. So if you want to kind of continue on to this conversation from this lecture and some of the things that we've talked about and within the duality between the soul and the ego, carry on.
Yeah, and like, again, so, one of the aspects is that we were looking at, so we have the ego, which again is that life force energy. And this is the true ego, right? This isn't that false ego we spoke about a lot more last week,
right,
which kind of hijacks that life force energy. And what that false inflated ego does is it mistakes that life force energy for itself. And it's just like, oh, look how powerful I am. Mm-hmm. But really, that's not your power. That's the power of the universe that's coming through you, right? But that false ego kind of mistakes for it. And then before you know it, you're taking a picture in front of your mirror for your Facebook saying like, I'm the greatest mother effer that's ever lived. You know what I mean? With sunglasses. And it's all of a sudden this like false ego like takes over because it's just like...
Well, it interrupts the process of understanding how to acquire those experiences for the soul. So like we go outside, let's just say, to adventure out and to feel the oneness of God, right? So that was my reasoning personally here for all the climbing I've ever done in the last decade. It's never been about how high I can go with climbing. It's always just been about being connected to oneness. And it's felt out there a lot more until something's introduced that trips you from the experience, the true experience, which is the lower self-ego, which in this case, a metaphor would be like mirrors everywhere to see your actual self. But in this case, it's like a phone that we use to take a photo to say, this is where I was. And so much of that experience just goes right to that vessel, not your vessel, but another vessel. And that's where we're kind of playing this game all the time with. It's like, no, I went outside and I went there. And there's a difference between the person who went there without something to prove and then the person who went there just to be connected to source. And that's where you kind of can differentiate right away between two people. Two people went to the same place. One went there with the purpose of exposing where they've been and what they've done. And the other one there because that's where their heart felt to be within one of nature. And you'll find that they'll both have different experiences. Well, that wasn't that great. Everyone says it's such a great place to go. I don't understand. The other one's like, dude, I could have died and just stayed there for life, forever, for eternity. So it's amongst us all the time. What you're saying about like looking yourself in the mirror. It's like, I think that's why there is such trip ups, I guess, or what's the word I want to say? Like there's these hiccups along the way that like deter you away from like your mission by looking in the mirror and just being like, oh, I am. And it's like, no, your potentiality is in you, which is the ego that drives the soul.
Right.
To extract it from itself and just look at it and admire it is just a mere distraction, you know, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And again, you know, we're institutionalized to kind of think that way.
Right,
you know,
right.
we are institutionalized to not see that source of life and to kind of mistake the lower I for the, not for the uppercase I, right? That
Right.
lowercase self for the uppercase self. We're really promoted to give that energy. We're, you know, everybody is through the education system, through media, through social media influencers. We're all really just, again, channeling energy into Frankenstein's monster, right? We're not using that energy for the life force of ourselves. And we're just creating these monsters that kind of live outside of our bodies, you know, and that's like our social media, you know, I mean, again, social media is an amazing thing. Like this podcast has grown because of social media. I've met some of the most amazing people through social media. So there's definitely benefits to that connection. And I think that's part of the age of Aquarius, but it also has some very, you know, different negative aspects to it as well.
Well, like what you said about coming back, if you're going to make it all the way back home, it's like, remember, you decided to leave here to have the full experience. It is your job to come back here. It's not my job to come to you. And I feel like a lot of people along the way just kind of hide from that path, from saying like, no, I think I just want to, like, you know, stay within this like moment of recognizing my potential, which is the ego. You know what I mean? Like the lower ego, where you're like, I'm gonna take my time right now and just like focus on this, which is like, look how pretty it is, what I can make. And it's like, no, but it's meant to expand.
Yep.
You know?
Right.
So anyways.
Yeah, no. And I think that's a great way to kind of look at it, man, because we really do kind of find ourselves in that situation right now where you just have people who just don't even want to go through that process of thinking about the conscious evolution. They don't want to even think about spiritual evolution because they're like, oh, it's a lot of work. Or like, what if you're wrong? And you're like, well, what if you're wrong? You know what I mean? And like, to be completely honest, you do the first leap of faith in the spiritual progress, but once you do that leap of faith and you actually have like a spiritual moment, or you have this like transcendental moment, you no longer think it's just a theory. You know, you can experience spirituality. And what happens is when you do have these transcendental, even psychedelic, without even having taking a psychedelic, you then become a knower, and you can actually validate. And then actually what happens is you're like, no, that was the only real thing that's ever really happened to me. You know, that was one of the most realist things. Like, you know, you have the love of your family and you have your love of friends and all this stuff where we actually find these real metals of alchemy, like we've been talking about, that does feel real. Yeah. But when you do have these like transcendental spiritual experiences, like I remember when the moment I switched from being an atheist to understanding what spirituality was. I was in a hot springs and was with this awesome gypsy friend, and she just looked at me, and I was just like, I had my scientific blinders on, and she just looked at me and she's like, no, God is energy. And for some reason, I've heard that a million times, but it was the space I was in. I was in these cool hot springs that used to be Apache territory. It was the coolest place I've ever been. It's called Eden, Arizona. And for all of a sudden, just everything dropped. My whole universe just dropped down. And all of a sudden I had my first like real spiritual experience. And actually, you know, once I had that, I realized that I've had this in the past. I just didn't know what it was going on. Yeah. And it was really, really powerful. But like, just like that, that was what that did, is it validated everything else that was real. Like I remember having the same kind of experience when I went to Havasupai with my father. I had the same kind of experience when my nephew was born. Like once I realized what that was, at the time, I just thought it was euphoria, but it wasn't euphoria. It was this finer substance, the substance that comes down from the finer realms. And it was just like raining this substance on me. And it was the most liberating, eye-opening thing in the world. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what kind of led to that. And I mean, I don't really know exactly where I was going with that, but like, that was the most real thing, you know? So like when people tell you like, oh, what if you're wrong? And you're like, yeah, but what if you're wrong? Like, what if you're wasting your time? Like, what if you are just collecting a bunch of dross that's just going to fade away, you know? And we have to kind of go through that experience, and we kind of have to understand that. And I think that's what's so important about learning the science behind the soul, like we read in this chapter. And we're going to kind of get further and further in, because I think today we kind of just did like a skim over, but there is a science to consciousness,
right?
And it's just like any other science. If you want to be successful in any other industry, you have to learn about that industry. You have to experience that thing. So like, if you want to be like, you're becoming a skilled carpenter, like you've been working with wood and you've been doing that. Well, you're exponentially going to get better and have better outcome the more experience and the more information you know.
Absolutely.
Spirituality is no different. You know what I mean? That's why we listen to this podcast. That's why we listen to this podcast. That's why we listen to that's why we read Manly P. Hall, because again, your ability to be successful is always going to come down to the same kind of basic principle of how much information do you know and how much experience do you have with this?
Absolutely.
And that's why we kind of learn, and that's why we kind of go through this whole lesson of life.
Absolutely, man. Everything you're saying, I mean, I know you were saying like, what does it have to do with anything with your experiences? But it's good to hear, even from your perspective. I mean, you are, the individual who sits across from me, but from your acquired experiences, as we were talking about, which is what the soul will go through its potentiality of the ego, I can then now either strive to have such experiences, which will also elevate my consciousness, or I can just like, try to see you as this individual who's been to these great places that I haven't been to. Good for him. And I separate myself from that information that I've just learned about you, which is a sad, not purpose for living, but it's a sad way of living with these limited breaths that we have here, is to compare yourself to one thing that you haven't experienced, rather than just say, you know what, I should just take my own experiences and feel the same ramifications that he has felt or she has felt in order to like be at peace or be at ease. And I think that's very interesting that people don't take the time to do such things, for numerous reasons, right? I can't speak for everyone, but I know what you're saying, and we definitely change along the way through those experiences. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you just brought up a great point, man, that I didn't even think about, but that lower ego separates us,
right?
Because that's that lower ego kicking in, being like, oh, well, they went through that experience, I'm never going to go through that experience, or oh, they've got a loving partner, I'm never going to have a loving partner. And that's that ego that sets up that jealousy, that sets up that greed, right? But that higher ego recognizes, no, your experience is my experience, and like the stuff that's beating your heart is beating my heart. So if you have a spiritual experience, that doesn't mean that means I definitely have the opportunity to have a spiritual experience.
Absolutely.
You found love, that means I definitely have the opportunity to find love. Like, it's this entire aspect of like, if one true ego can do it, all the true egos can do it. Right. Because it's the same life force. It's just how you're expressing that life force. How much, where are your blocks, and where do you break those blocks down? But again, that's where the soul kind of comes into place. And that's where it's the totality of our experience that really kind of brings us forward. And again, that totality of that experience is kind of like what we were talking about when it comes to the perspective of the experience. If you're very negative about your experiences, you're going to be building a less complex structure that's going to not have a foundation, and you're going to see that structure with like hate and angst, and you're going to be like mad at your structure, right? But if you actually look at your life from a positive aspect of, through growth and maturity, you can create something beautiful. It's like Willy Wonka, like, we are the music makers, but you decide what song you're going to play.
Exactly.
Right? Like the universe is going to give you different notes, but you can kind of put them in the order you want. And you can kind of arrange this piece perfectly. Even if the universe only gives you a couple colors to paint with, you still can make a masterpiece,
right?
And you can't compare yourself to somebody who gets, the Crayola box with like 64 crayons and the sharpener.
Yeah.
Like, you can't be mad because you got like the box of 4. You just have to do the best with what you got.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And that's what this experience is. And again, that's why we're all on our own differentiation, but we're still using that life force energy to power us through.
Yeah. And that's what's good about understanding the ego from the perspective that we're bringing up in calcination, and the one when we keep using the word ego, understand how it works within its this like dance. It can't be one without the other, and you can separate the two, but we just talked about why you don't need to separate the two, and it doesn't benefit anyone if you do it. It's best that if you use the potentiality of the ego, the life force you're talking about, to let the soul go through its experiences, we can then rise to the next level, which is what's going to go into the whole purpose of alchemy, right? We've talked about this with the episode of alchemy, and we'll say it again. This 7-step process is, the betterment of this soul, of this purpose that we're here to go back home. And so understanding each stage, there's a lot of, I know we both just talked a lot, but there's a lot to unravel in between each of those stages. And in actuality, this conversation we're having right now between two friends on this podcast is part of that process in itself, not just for the listeners and to the ears and to the consciousness of you obtaining this information, or you being conscious of this information and trying to decipher through it. We're deciphering through it together. You know what I mean? I'm not here to tell you I know more than what you know just because I have this microphone right now, or Daniel knows more, but we're both sort of unraveling that together without having to segregate each step of the way, the individuals who don't understand and those who do understand. It's like, no, we're all sort of like evolving and going up that ladder together as a one, right? Mm-hmm. As a unit. So that's awesome. I like that you bring up those stories. I know definitely I've definitely had a lot of those moments where you sort of like separate yourself from the moment at hand and realize you've always been part of the entire experience from the very get-go. And they're super profound. And I hope for those listeners out there, that have a lot of stories or have had a lot of life experiences can relate to what Daniel was just saying about these places. Arizona is a great place for that, by the way. For us, as I've gotten older now, I've realized that in our backyard, we've always had, I've realized it all my life, that we've had this place that allows us to sort of reach that level of understanding a lot quicker than us to like waiting a long time for doing something like the Appalachian Trail when you're in your mid-20s. It's like, no, since we were kids, we've been just like communing with Mother Nature. And within that, we've been able to like actually understand such things like as above, so below, because we'll have those moments where you're like, there is no divide here. It's just a stretch from one higher place to this place that I'm in right now. And I'm just like in between the two, and I'm trying to make my way back up. I'm very grateful for the experiences we've had thus far. I know I can definitely tell a few stories, but I'll wait for the right time and place to bring up some of those stories, because a lot of them. But anyways, this is great, man.
I love it. And again, this wasn't, I think, so much the conversation that we were planning on having, but I just kind of like that we kind of skim the surface on a lot of these interesting ideas. So we will go into the cycle of necessity. We will kind of look into that de-evolution of the soul falling into matter, and then its rise up Jacob's ladder. And we will kind of look a little bit more into, that will kind of really kind of focus in. We really kind of looked at the totality of the soul when it came to experiences today.
Right.
So when we do the cycle of necessity, we'll kind of focus a little bit more in its ability to attract and its ability to attract other forms.
Yeah.
So, as you get done with one experience, you actually start vibrating away from the form you're in, and you start to attract another form. And we're going to see how that aspect actually, this is what is the psychic science behind the law of attraction. So not only can we attract life events into us and kind of what we really want to focus our minds on, but it's even bigger than that. Like that energy that does the attraction that people talk about with The Secret, the reason why you have that ability is because your soul literally attracted this life form that you're in right now. And at one point it's going to move away from this life form. Right. And that's going to be one of the aspects that we're going to be kind of looking at. And, what this does is it really does kind of make the individual more comfortable with the idea of death, because they know that death is just a rebirth into a new life. And one of the things that, when you ask like a real Freemason, not a Freemason that's doing it for like business or connections, but like an actual, like maybe more of an ancient Freemason, they would ask like, why do you study the craft? And the answer is, when you get really high into the illuminated levels past the 32nd degree, was to know how to die. And that's a very important aspect. And again, I think, that's going to be something that we all are going to approach, and we're all going to have to understand, because nothing in this material realm is forever. So we're going to have to deal with the deaths of others. We're going to have to deal with our own deaths. And it's very important that we get an understanding of that. And we don't treat that with this blank expression of just fear and this unknown, but we can actually know that we can understand what that process is. And, again, it's always going to be hard when we lose loved ones, but, when we really kind of learn about this law of necessity and this cycle of necessity, you really kind of get a more complete picture to what this is all about. And, Alan Watts said it great, like, what if happens if when you die, you actually wake up and you wake up into a higher form of life? And, from what we've studied, that's kind of what alludes to it. You know?
No, way to really like make an understanding of the cycle of necessity, because when I was reading about the cycle of necessity and like the complexity of it and like what it means for it to be at a state of in that spiritual realm, that higher self, that it possesses neither consciousness nor feeling. Mm-hmm. Like, I think he did a great job at sort of alluding to that by just like what we've just been discussing just on this conversation of like what that is. Because I was like, I'm going to ask Daniel more about the cycle of necessity and really understand like, okay, what is the cycle of necessity? And then when we go into the other things we want to discuss, like why are we here? We talked about that. We'll end up having that for another podcast. We want to be able to sort of tie all that together along the way of breaking down the 7 steps of alchemy. So I know it's a lot of information, but dude, I think what you're saying is, for me at least, like from what I've read in the lecture, is right on point. So
yeah, and what we could kind of look at today is just kind of like the introduction to a conversation we're going to have for the next couple of weeks, by like a bi-weekly conversation in between the steps of alchemy. And I almost could think we can like quote it, the mission of the soul, which is the exact same of the chapter that we're reading in this Brotherhood of Light book. But that's really what we're talking about, the mission of the soul and how the soul's powered by the ego. Right. And how it's the totality of the experiences and how it's also the aspect of being able to attract forms and experiences into our life. And if we can attract, we can also repel. And, and that kind of comes down to the whole aspect of how do you utilize that energy. And yeah, it's just a really exciting subject. And, one thing too is that I would love to kind of go into is like, there's just so much stuff to talk about. But like the cycle of necessity is just so fascinating, and the evolution of our souls and the true totality of our experience beyond just our self-conscious experience, but everything that happened before we took our first breath as humans. It's just an endless subject, and I'm just really excited to have this conversation with you guys.
It's like with the metaphor, again, I love the idea of mountains. I'm obsessed with mountains. I do have an air sign, and I always like that the ego takes us up the mountain, right? Without this physical body at the age that I'm at right now, I may not be able to get to such altitude. So I drive myself to get to such altitude, but with only one goal in mind, and that's just to take a breath at a higher level of existence while I'm here. Mm-hmm. And that's what the ego allowed me to do, is to get up there. So I hope this all makes sense in the sense that the ego is not bad. If we brought it up last week with calcination and bringing up the ego, we tried to define that, saying, look, the ego is necessarily a bad thing. We're not trying to kill the ego, but more so understand it and tame it and use its life force to project us to the next step, to be able to see our total potential and just elevate everyone around us to that level as well. You know what I mean? But it is tricky. Again, like it's funny, but I think for the remainder of time, words that are so beautiful that we have all learned and experienced within using them just get recycled and repurposed to define things as a negative or a positive aspect of something that we're doing. And it's a slippery slope, because then people don't want to use that word to identify themselves when in reality it's not necessarily a negative. It's what you do with the understanding of that concept that makes a negative or a positive. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's great that we're breaking down such a word like the ego in more detail as we use it along the way of these definitions or these principles within alchemy and even other hermetic principles that we'll keep bringing up. But yeah, it's fascinating, man.
Yeah, it's the best. It's the greatest story of all time. It's the great work.
So, well, cool. So next week we'll move into dissolution. Have we covered what we wanted to cover today with the mission of the soul? And we'll keep
I think it's a great introduction, man. Like we said, I think this is a great introduction. I think there is many more conversations that we can kind of have on this subject, and really kind of looking again, like what these all entail and why this is important for you to know. But yeah, I think this is a great little introduction just to kind of get us thinking and kind of get our mindsets in that aspect as we move forward.
No, I love that in between each stage of alchemy, we'll have another conversation within such, specific ideas and definitions in between the stuff that we've covered for us to have like a more rounded understanding of this entire process of that Jacob's ladder, or getting up to a higher level of understanding self-consciousness, or what really self-consciousness can be.
Up and away. Right?
Up and away, man. Cool, dude. Well, I have nothing else to add. Do you?
Until next time.
Until next time. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Not only does it give us the energy we need, it also gives us an opportunity to make a positive environmental impact.
Earthling Food Company originated from the simple truth that what is good for the body is good for the planet. They create delicious, plant-based food that lifts us up rather than weighs us down. That's right, you will never find preservatives, refined sugar, oil, animal products, gluten, or any other crap that is environmentally destructive. Only the good stuff.
Would you like a hearty granola that is both delicious and healthy? What about something with zero cholesterol or an alternative to scrambled eggs? Earthly Food Company has you covered. They are a brand new husband and wife startup, so check back regularly for new products.
Greg and Jen have been listeners and supporters of the Know Thyself podcast since our very first episode. We first collected on a philosophical conversation, and then through the conversation learned about this really exciting new project that they were creating, which is a organic, amazing granola that they want to share with all the listeners of our community.
Artisan granola and seasoning make a great holiday gift. Visit earthlingfood.company. That's earthlingfood.company.
Did you say earthlingfood.company?
That's exactly what I said. To order online and use the discount code Know Thyself, that's one word, Know Thyself, for 15% off your purchase. They are also offering free shipping on orders over $70, so order online today.
I would do it like right now.